The prairie wind carried no mercy that night. It cut across the camp like a blade, scattering embers from dying fires, as if to remind her she no longer belonged. She had no mother, no father, no name strong enough to shield her from judgment. The elders spoke her fate in whispers, but the tribe obeyed in silence. She would be cast out. By dawn, her footprints led away from the only home she had ever known, into a wilderness that devoured the weak and tested even the strongest. Her people turned their backs, and the stars above became her only witnesses. She walked with nothing but a blanket and the sound of her own breath. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the cold bit her skin raw. Yet the pain that hurt most was not a body. It was the hollow ache of being unseen, unloved, unwanted. Every step into the barren land felt like an echo of abandonment, and she wondered if the earth itself had decided she wasn't worth remembering. But sometimes, the West has a way of writing stories where endings are torn open by the unexpected. The next morning, as the sun bled red over the horizon, she collapsed near the edge of a dry creek bed. And it was there, between silence and surrender, that a stranger appeared. He was not from her tribe, nor from the white towns that pushed deeper into the land. He looked as worn as the desert itself, scarred, sunburned, with eyes that carried the weight of too many losses. He should have passed her by, as others had, but he didn't. He knelt. He lifted her from the dust as though she was not a burden, but a reason. The tribe had cast her out to die. The land had offered her no shelter. Yet this man, this stranger, risked everything by choosing to stop. In that single act, something shifted, not just in her fate, but in the rhythm of the land itself. Because in the Old West, where mercy was often rarer than gold, the decision to help a forgotten soul could spark a story that burned brighter than vengeance and endured longer than bloodlines. That day, an orphaned woman found a protector. But by the next dawn, she would realize he was far more than that. He was a man willing to stake his life against the wrath of her people, the judgment of the world, and the silence of the earth itself, just to prove that the forgotten deserved to be remembered. The stranger's name was Daniel, though few called him that anymore. Most who knew of him only whispered, "the drifter," a man who carried no ties but bore the scars of too many battles with land and man alike. When he lifted the orphan woman from the dust, he did not ask her name. He did not ask why she had been abandoned. In the Old West, explanations were luxuries, and mercy was its own language. He gave her water from his canteen and tore strips from his own shirt to bind her bleeding feet. For the first time in days, she felt the weight of another's care. She could barely speak, but when her lips finally parted, she whispered, "Why?" Her voice cracked like dry wood. Daniel only shrugged, "Because no one else will." That answer, simple as it was, carved itself into her heart. In her world, kindness had always come with a price. Yet here stood a man who asked for nothing. No allegiance, no gratitude, no promise. He simply stayed. And staying, in a land that had abandoned her, was an act of defiance against the silence that had cast her out. By nightfall, he had built a small fire. The flames flickered against his face, showing eyes that had seen too much, but refused to close. She sat across from him, the warmth brushing her skin like an old memory. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. The stars above stretched wide, indifferent as always, but now their vastness felt less like judgment and more like witness. She was not invisible, not anymore. Still, the danger was not gone. Her tribe would not ignore her disappearance forever. In their eyes, her exile was absolute. If they learned she had been helped, the punishment would not fall on her alone. It would fall on the man who had dared to stand beside her. Yet Daniel showed no fear of that truth. He looked at the horizon as if he'd already made peace with the idea that some risks were worth taking, even if they cost a life. And for the first time since being cast out, the orphan woman felt something stir beneath her grief. Not safety, not certainty, but hope, a fragile, flickering thing, as delicate as the fire between them, yet powerful enough to shift the air around her. The following morning, Daniel guided her toward the river valley, where wild berries clung to the bushes and fresh water carved its way through the land. She walked slowly, her body still weak, but each step seemed less heavy than the one before. Daniel carried no map, Yet he moved with the instinct of one who had learned to trust the land more than men. He pointed out which plants she could eat, which roots carried healing, and which shadows warned of predators. She listened. She learned. For the first time, she was no longer walking toward death, but toward knowledge. By the riverbank, she washed her face, watching her reflection tremble in the current. She did not see the girl her tribe had cast aside, the orphan they had branded as a burden. She saw a survivor, a woman still breathing when the world had decided she shouldn't. And when she lifted her gaze, she saw Daniel watching, not with pity, but with recognition. He too had been cast out once, in his own way. Perhaps that was why he had chosen to stop for her. But safety in the West was never more than a borrowed breath. That night, as they sheltered beneath the twisted branches of an old cottonwood, Daniel heard movement in the dark. Hooves, low voices. He motioned for her to stay still, his hand hovering over the worn revolver at his side. Through the shadows, he recognized them, warriors from her tribe. They weren't hunting game. They were hunting her. The orphan's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so loudly, she feared it would give them away. She knew what capture meant. No mercy, no trial, only punishment for her defiance. She looked at Daniel, expecting fear in his eyes. But what she saw instead was resolve, as steady as stone. He leaned close, his voice low but unshaking. If they come, they'll have to walk through me first. And in that moment, she understood the truth. He was not simply a drifter passing through. He was a man who carried no home, no family, but who still chose to stand for her when no one else would. And for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't just surviving. She was being defended. The riders circled closer, their torches cutting through the darkness like watchful eyes. Daniel pressed his back against the tree, keeping the orphan shielded behind him. His revolver rested in his hand, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. In the West, a gun fired too quickly wasn't a weapon. It was a death sentence. He waited, silent, every muscle coiled like a bowstring. The warriors dismounted, their shadows bending long and thin across the firelit grass. One of them knelt, touching the soil where footprints still lingered. Daniel's jaw tightened. They were close. The orphan could feel her breath hitching, fear crawling like fire through her chest. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She had been hunted before, but never like this, with someone else's life at stake. She pressed her palm against the rough bark of the cottonwood, praying the tree could swallow her whole. Daniel reached back, steadying her with a touch that was more command than comfort. "Breathe," he whispered. Just one word. But it anchored her, holding her still when everything in her screamed to flee. The lead warrior stepped forward, his face painted in streaks of ash, his eyes narrowed against the dark. He called her name, not with gentleness, but with venom, as though speaking it alone would pull her back into their grasp. Daniel didn't move. He didn't answer. The silence stretched so long it seemed the earth itself leaned in to listen. Then, slowly, the warrior's eyes shifted toward the tree, and toward them. His hand went to his bow. It happened in an instant. Daniel moved like lightning, not to fire, but to throw a stone into the brush opposite them. The sound cracked like a branch breaking, scattering the warrior's attention for a heartbeat. Just enough. He grabbed the orphan's hand, pulling her through the shadows toward the riverbank. They ran barefoot, every step tearing skin, every breath a gamble. Behind them, the warriors shouted. Arrows whistled through the night, missing by inches. The chase had begun. By the time they reached the river, the moon had risen high, turning the water silver. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled her into the current, the cold biting like knives against their skin. They waded through the rushing water, letting it carry their scent, their trail, their chance at survival. And as they stumbled onto the far bank, drenched and trembling, Daniel looked back only once. His eyes burned, not with fear, but with promise. He had risked everything to protect her, and he wasn't finished yet. Dawn came with no mercy. Their bodies ached from the night's escape, their clothes clung heavy with river water, and their stomachs cried out for food. Yet neither spoke of turning back. Daniel built a small fire in a hollow, hidden beneath the rocks, where the smoke could rise unseen. He gave the orphan the last strip of dried meat he carried. She shook her head at first, tried to push it back into his hands. But he only said, "You'll need it more." His voice was rough, but steady, the voice of a man used to hunger and to sacrifice. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him fully in the morning light. His face bore lines carved not by age, but by hardship. A scar cut across his jaw. His hands were torn and raw, the hands of someone who had fought the land as much as men. Yet behind all of it was something harder to name, something unbroken. She realized then that he wasn't saving her out of pity. He was saving her because he believed she deserved to be saved, and no one had ever believed that before. But danger was far from over. The tribe would not abandon their pursuit, not after the shame of losing her to exile, and not after she had been seen with a stranger. To them, she was no longer just an orphan. She was a symbol of defiance, and symbols in the Old West were not left alive. She knew the warriors would keep hunting, night after night, until blood was spilled. And now, Daniel's blood was at risk too. Her heart twisted with guilt. She had been cast out to die alone, but now someone else might die for her. As the sun climbed, Daniel studied the horizon. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. "They'll come again," he said. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The orphan looked at him, confused. "We." He met her gaze, and in his silence, she understood. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't walking away when things grew dangerous. Whatever storm was coming, he had already decided to face it, beside her. That night, as the fire cracked low, she whispered her truth into the dark. How her parents had been taken in a raid. How the tribe had fed her, but never accepted her. How every glance, every whisper, had carved her into an outsider long before the day they finally exiled her. And when her voice broke, Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way the land sometimes listens, without judgment, without answers, but with the kind of silence that heals. And in that silence, she realized she was no longer alone. The next day brought no peace. Tracks appeared along the riverbank, proof that the warriors were still hunting. Daniel crouched low, brushing his fingers across the soil, his eyes narrowing. "They're close," he muttered. The orphan's chest tightened. Fear returned like a familiar shadow, but this time it was different. She was no longer a girl cast out to die. She had someone who chose to stand beside her, and that choice burned brighter than fear. Daniel led her into the hills, where the rocks jutted like broken teeth and caves lay hidden among the cliffs. They climbed until their lungs burned, until the ground below was swallowed by distance. From that height, the valley stretched out wide, wild, endless, unforgiving. Yet in that vastness, she felt something unexpected: freedom. For the first time, she was not bound by the stares of her people, nor the weight of exile. She was bound only by survival, and by the man who refused to leave her behind. At night, when the firelight danced against the cave walls, Daniel taught her small things: how to sharpen stone in a blade, how to listen to the call of owls, how to breathe steady when fear tried to crush the lungs. She absorbed every lesson, her mind hungry, her spirit restless. She wasn't just being protected anymore. She was being prepared. Daniel wasn't building a shield around her. He was building a fire within her. The orphan began to see herself differently. She wasn't just the unwanted child, cast out like waste. She was a woman learning the language of survival, learning to carve her own place into a land that had tried to erase her. And every glance Daniel gave her, steady, unwavering, was another reminder that worth wasn't given by blood or tribe. Worth was proven by endurance. But the hills did not protect them for long. By the third day, Daniel heard the howl of a horn echoing from the ridge below, a sound older than memory, a call of pursuit that carried not just across the land, but deep into the bones. The warriors had found their trail again, and this time there would be no running. The horn's cry hung in the air, and Daniel knew the truth. They would have to stand their ground. He turned to the orphan, his voice low but firm. "You've got two choices. Keep running until the earth swallows you, or stand and show them you're more than what they cast aside." Her throat tightened. She had never been asked to fight, never been trusted to. But in his words, she felt something awaken. She was tired of being chased, tired of being unseen. For the first time, she wanted to stand. They set their trap in silence. Daniel used the terrain, blocking narrow paths with stones, scattering loose gravel across slopes where horses would stumble. The orphan gathered wood for torches, her hands trembling but determined. Every movement carried weight. This wasn't just survival. It was reclamation. The land that had once felt like an enemy now felt like an ally, and she was learning how to wield it. Night fell heavy. The warriors came with torches, their chants echoing through the canyons. The firelight lit their painted faces, fierce and certain of victory. But they hadn't expected resistance. Not from her. When they closed in, she stepped forward with a torch in her hand, the flames casting her shadow against the stone wall like a figure twice her size. For the first time, she faced them not as prey, but as equal. Daniel stood at her side, revolver steady, but his eyes on her, not the warriors. This was her moment. The orphaned woman, cast out and forgotten, looked into the eyes of the men who had abandoned her and did not flinch. She raised her voice, sharp as steel. You thought you ended me, but I'm still here, and I am not yours to claim. The warriors hesitated. The fire crackled. The canyons seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, she was not silent. For the first time, she was not hidden. And the woman who had once been cast out had become something far greater. She had become seen. The flames from her torch painted the canyon walls in violent orange, and the warriors stared at her as though they were seeing a ghost who had learned how to speak. For a heartbeat, none moved. The orphaned woman stood tall, her voice still ringing through the narrow pass. Daniel didn't step forward, didn't overshadow her. He knew this moment wasn't his, it was hers. The woman who had once been silent now had the power to silence others. One warrior lowered his bow. His eyes flickered with doubt, with memory. He remembered the girl they had mocked, the orphan they had abandoned. Now she stood before them, not broken, but blazing. Another warrior whispered something under his breath, and the fire crackled louder, almost as if answering. The air itself seemed to bend toward her, carrying her words deeper than her voice could reach. Takota, the elder who had ordered her exile, stepped into view. His hair hung long, his face lined with years of command. He stared at her with eyes sharp as stone. You are nothing, he said. His voice was steady, but it wavered at the edges, as if even he no longer fully believed his own words. She met his gaze, her torch unwavering. If I was nothing, then why do you fear me now? The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The warriors shifted uneasily. For the first time, the balance of power did not tilt toward Dakota. It tilted toward the woman they had cast aside. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, steady. The land doesn't keep what it no longer needs. And she's still here. His words dropped like stones into a well, echoing in the minds of everyone present. And in that moment, something ancient shifted, not in the fire, not in the weapons, but in the hearts of those who watched. The orphan woman was no longer prey. She was a force the land itself had refused to erase. The standoff stretched into the night. No arrows loosed, no blades drawn, only firelight, heavy breaths, and the beating truth that could not be silenced. Takota's jaw tightened as he looked at his warriors, men who once would have followed him without question. But now, their eyes flickered toward her, toward the woman they had abandoned. And in their silence, he saw his grip loosening. One by one, the warriors lowered their weapons. Not in surrender, but in recognition. Recognition of what she had become, of what she had survived, of the undeniable fact that exile had not destroyed her, it had forged her. The orphan stepped forward, her torch lighting the space between them. She did not beg to be welcomed back. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply said, I do not need your shelter. I carry my own. Daniel's presence at her side was steady, unshaken. He had risked everything for her, but now it was clear. She no longer needed him as shield. She needed him as witness. The man who had lifted her from the dust had not saved her. He had helped her see she had been strong all along. And now the tribe saw it too. Takota's voice finally broke the silence. Leave, he said. His words cracked, hollow, drained of power. But there was no venom left in them, only resignation. The warriors obeyed, fading back into the night, their torches dimming one by one. Soon, only the canyon remained, holding the echo of a battle that had never needed steel to be won. When the last torch disappeared, the orphan lowered hers, the firelight soft against her face. She looked at Daniel, not with relief, but with understanding. Her exile had not ended. It had transformed. She was not returning to her people. She was stepping into her own story. And from that night forward, no one who had stood in that canyon could ever speak her name with pity again. They would speak it with reverence, with memory, with the weight of a truth the Old West would never forget, that even the forgotten can rise, and when they do, the world must make room. The days after the canyon felt different, quieter, as if the land itself had shifted. The orphan woman no longer carried the shadow of exile on her back. Each step she took felt heavier, not with shame, but with purpose. She and Daniel traveled beyond the ridges, their path uncertain. Yet she no longer walked as one who was cast aside. She walked as one who had chosen to rise. Wherever she went, she carried the fire of that night, the proof that her people's judgment had not defined her spirit. Daniel noticed the change in her before she did. She no longer lowered her gaze when strangers passed. She no longer flinched at the sound of hooves in the distance. Instead, she asked questions about the land, about the stars, about how to build a life not bound by the weight of others' choices. And Daniel, though scarred by his own past, found himself answering with patience he never thought he had left. The drifter who once carried nothing but silence now carried a companion whose strength reminded him why he had never fully given up. But the West was never kind for long. One evening, as they camped near a dry gulch, a band of outlaws appeared, guns on their hips, greed in their eyes. They saw a woman, vulnerable in their minds, and a man too worn to protect her. They thought it would be easy. Yet when they stepped forward, demanding everything the pair had, it was not Daniel who answered first. It was her. She rose with the same steady fire she had carried in the canyon, her voice unshaking as she declared, "Take nothing that isn't yours, or the land will remember your theft." The outlaws laughed at first, but then they saw Daniel, standing beside her, revolver drawn, silent as death. And they realized too late that this was no helpless pair. This was a force shaped by fire, exile, and defiance. The outlaws backed away, muttering curses, but they did not fire. They left, and when the dust settled, Daniel looked at her with something close to awe. She had not just found her strength. She had claimed it. That night, by the fire, she told him something she had never said aloud. "They call me nothing, but you show me I was more. And now, I know it too." Her words hung in the air like a vow, carried by the flames into the stars. Seasons passed. The prairie shifted from green to gold, from snow to bloom, but her fire never dimmed. Stories of the orphaned woman began to spread, not as whispers of shame, but as tales of survival. Travelers spoke of a woman who had once been cast out, yet now stood taller than the warriors who had turned their backs. They said she carried her exile like a crown, her silence like a weapon, her story like a song the land itself refused to forget. Daniel remained with her, not as protector, but as equal. He had once been a drifter, a man untethered, but in her he found something the West rarely offered: belonging. Together, they built not walls, but paths. Paths for others who had been forgotten, outcasts who wandered with no home, souls abandoned by blood but not by spirit. The orphaned woman who had once been left to die had now become a beacon for those who needed proof that survival could be turned into destiny. Her people never came for her again. Perhaps they feared what she had become. Perhaps they understood that to confront her now was to confront the truth of their own cruelty. Either way, her name grew louder than theirs. She was no longer the orphan. She was the woman who had faced exile, endured the hunt, and stood unbroken before fire and steel. And because of that, she became a story mothers told their children, not as warning, but as hope. One evening, years later, as she sat beside Daniel watching the sunset bleed across the plains, she whispered, "They gave me nothing, but I gave myself everything." Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The land around them seemed to echo her words, carrying them into the horizon like thunder rolling across endless sky. And so her story lived on, not because she was spared, not because she was saved, but because, when the world cast her into dust, she stood, and the dust turned to fire. In the Old West, where so many were forgotten, her truth could never be erased. Even the abandoned can rise, and when they do, the land must bow to remember them. In the Old West, where life was often measured by bloodlines, survival, and scars, one woman rewrote the meaning of strength. She was cast aside, branded as nothing, and left to vanish into dust. Yet with every step, every breath, she transformed her exile into proof that being forgotten does not mean being defeated. And with Daniel by her side, she discovered that sometimes the fiercest battles are not fought with weapons, but with the refusal to let shame become destiny. Her journey became more than survival. It became a testament that worth is not given by others, but claimed within. The tribe that had turned its back on her could not erase her fire. The land that tested her could not break her will. And the voices that once called her nothing became the very soil on which she built her legacy. She rose, not because she was chosen, but because she chose herself. And that choice carried more power than any blade ever could. What began as a story of exile grew into a story of defiance. And what began as defiance blossomed into a story of renewal. She stood tall, not only for herself, but for every forgotten soul who had been silenced, shamed, or abandoned. In her, the world saw the undeniable truth. The outcast can become the center, the hunted can become the guide, and the orphan can become the flame that lights the way for others. So when you think of her story, don't just remember the pain of exile. Remember the moment she stood, torch in hand, her voice stronger than any weapon, declaring that she was not theirs to break. Remember that her survival was not luck, it was a decision. And that decision is one each of us can make. To rise when the world pushes us down, to stand when silence demands we bow, to live as proof that being cast aside is not the end, but the beginning. If this story spoke to you, let it continue beyond this moment. Subscribe to the channel to walk alongside more stories like hers. Leave a like if her courage lit something inside you, and share your reflections in the comments. Because every voice you add, every thought you share, becomes part of this circle, proof that even in silence, no one truly stands alone.